In one of Dragon Ball Super's side stories, we see an interesting manga chapter where Goten and Trunks were protecting Android 17's Monster Island, and on this Monster Island they encountered Cell Juniors, which were giving them quite a hard time. And this is one of the questions that you guys have asked me the most in the comment section, as I've shown this manga panel several times throughout various videos. How in the world did the Cell Juniors actually survive? Now, to start off, the first thing that we have to do is make a direct comparison between the Dragon Ball anime and the Dragon Ball manga. And in the Dragon Ball anime specifically, we could actually see that Gohan actually killed 8 Cell Juniors, and I'm saying 8 intentionally because if you look on your screen right here, it was originally an animation mistake when Gohan fought against the Cell Juniors, in fact, and there was actually a duplicate Cell Junior that was essentially created, and you can see Super Saiyan 2 Gohan killing him right here. But despite all of that, guys, going back to that original animation, if you go back and you look at how Gohan killed them specifically, you can see that the way the Cell Juniors died is that they were being completely eviscerated after he hit them. And the shock of his hit was so powerful that they essentially completely exploded to a point where you could have never have imagined them actually regenerating. But when we look at them in the manga adaptation, this is a totally different case. Gohan actually mutilates all of the Cell Juniors to the point where they get ripped apart, but there's still enough body matter of them specifically that you can theoretically imagine them regenerating from. Now, if we go back to Dragon Ball Super's manga adaptation, there was a line that specifically said, quote for quote, "Cell could regenerate endlessly as long as the core cluster of cells in his head wasn't obliterated. Perhaps the Cell Juniors possessed a similar ability. If so, maybe those 7 original 7 survived to this day." Now, that directly goes in contradiction because obviously Goku originally blasted Cell's entire core when he used his Warp Kamehameha attack, so that was a contradiction that even Toriyama admitted that he made a mistake with. But if we were to translate this to the Cell Juniors, because of the fact that they weren't completely eviscerated in the manga adaptation, this would actually make a lot more sense when we're looking at it in the manga in terms of trying to explain all of this, even though it wouldn't completely make sense for the Dragon Ball anime. And some fans have basically been saying that these aren't the real Cell Juniors because of a statement that Android 17 said. 17 specifically said, "Oh, forgot to tell them about the pseudo Cell Juniors." Pseudo what? Now explain. You mean like those creepy little things that Gohan beat way back then? Yeah, you should remember 18 since we had a full view of the battle while inside Cell's body. Anyway, there just so happened to be some creatures on Monster Island that look exactly like those Cell Juniors. 7 of them, just like before and just all as strong. So obviously, the statement that 17 made was trying to imply that maybe they're not Cell Juniors, but based off of the fact that they look exactly like them, and based off of the fact that there's exactly 7 of them, and also based off of the fact that if the Cell Juniors have cells, then they could be able to regenerate, then we can definitely conclude that the Cell Juniors are in fact the Cell Juniors that we originally saw, especially because 17 specifically said that they're all just as strong. And when you consider the fact that Goten and Trunks have gotten quite a bit stronger over the years relative to where they were before, even if you say they've been slacking off, the fact that these creatures could even fight Goten and Trunks at all would have to mean that they were abnormally powerful and they couldn't be any other species. So as a result of that, we can definitely conclude that they're definitely the Cell Juniors. Now, 17 also said something that was very interesting later on. If you go back, he also specifically said that he tamed them. Now, what I find interesting about this statement is that it kind of shows something going back to the Cell Juniors, that they are effectively kids and can be controlled in a way. Whereas if you look at Cell, who I guess you could say is the adult Cell, because the Cell Juniors are young, you can essentially tame them to work on your side. And there have been a lot of fans that took a statement that Krillin said very literally when Krillin specifically said, "I'm starting to understand what makes you so strong." Now, the interesting thing here is that theoretically, from the manga's perspective, it actually makes more sense as to how Android 17 could have gotten so strong if he did somehow train with the Cell Juniors on this island. It would at least have given him a power boost from what he originally was. But if we compare this to the anime adaptation and say the manga and the anime are supposed to tie into each other, then it still is not enough to explain how he could have been able to at least fight briefly against a Super Saiyan Blue when you consider the fact that the Cell Juniors are so significantly weak by that point that it's kind of like that whole thing that I mentioned in a previous video of RuneScape. At a certain point, for you to get stronger on RuneScape, you have to fight against stronger monsters, because if you keep fighting against weaker monsters over and over again, it's going to take a lot more experience points to actually level up. And at the point that 17 would have been in Dragon Ball Super, he clearly must have had other training methods to get that powerful. But there's some other points that we must also add about the Cell Juniors specifically. And to be specific, we also have to mention that they've died multiple times. Now, the first time that they might have died was when Super Buu used his extinction attack. Now, obviously, maybe they were able to avoid that and survive, but if they did somehow survive that, then they definitely died when Kid Buu blew up the entire planet. And here's where we can make a very, very strong judgment call that the Cell Juniors are effectively tame or good now, is because of the fact that if the original Dragon Ball story is supposed to tie into Dragon Ball Super, that means when the wish was made to bring everybody back except for the really, really bad ones, even though that doesn't completely make sense because there's still really bad people in the Dragon Ball Super world, especially because we could still see robbers and stuff, as we saw Goten and Trunks fighting criminals as X1 and X2, but maybe that was just being specific, the really bad ones, and we have to take into account maybe they're not as evil as the ones that were not selected to come back to life. But the point that we're trying to get at here specifically is that if the Cell Juniors theoretically came back, then that means they're not considered to be that evil, and that means that 17 was probably already taming them specifically by this point. This would also explain another question, where why didn't the Cell Juniors attack during all of these years? Now, obviously, compared to the strongest characters on Earth, the Cell Juniors are not a threat, but compared to the weaker human fighters or even just random civilians, they're literally the most powerful beings on the planet. This is one of the reasons why I would have much preferred that in Dragon Ball Super Superhero, they would have had a plot that actually involved the Cell Juniors on planet Earth, or if Dr. Hito could somehow extract a Cell Junior in some type of way and do examinations on that specific Cell Junior to recreate Cell in his perfect form. That would have been a very interesting thing that we could have seen with the storyline, because the big question is, when will these Cell Juniors eventually grow up? They can't be kids forever, and if we assume that they're supposed to mature and grow up, considering the fact that Dragon Ball Super is so much farther after the Cell Games arc, and the fact that they're still kids, obvious means that the way they grow up doesn't equate to how Cell grew up in a relatively short time. And this also brings up another question too about the Cell Juniors of maybe they'll just never grow up because they were just designed by Cell maybe specifically to just perpetually be underlings that are just subservient to doing what he wants them to do. And while we're probably never gonna get an answer to a lot of these questions, it's definitely fun to talk about, and it also adds a lot more to the lore of the Dragon Ball universe.